There we go. All right, welcome everyone. I'm very grateful you're here. Today I want to talk about 7 habits. The 7 habits of highly effective Chief Information Security Officers. This is a topic that is special to me. It's born out of first-hand observation of a lot of CISOs out there. And for starters, I use the term CISO in its literal sense, but also as, sort of a placeholder for individuals who have the highest job title that involves overall responsibility for protecting the assets of your organization. So by that definition, just to sort of level set with everyone in attendance here, how many CISOs are there in the room? 2, 3, thank you. How many former CISOs, recovering CISOs? 2, thank you. How many aspiring CISOs? Actually, the minority. Oh, thank you. So fantastic. We have a pretty sort of even room. And so for the former and current CISOs, please, hold me honest. I look to you to nod or disagree and have a conversation. And for those of us in the aspirational column, this is going to be my contribution of what it takes for us to be effective. So I'll start off by doing some level setting, and then we'll go from there. So why should you listen to me, right? First of all, because you're here. Let's face it, and you might as well. But more importantly, because in my 11 years working in information security, I have got to shadow quite a number of CISOs. So essentially, as a consultant, our engagements involve going into an organization and at the CISO's behest, sort of helping them set up a governance program or interacting with a cross-section of the organization. And so you get a pretty good sense, or at least I have gotten a pretty good sense in many organizations of how they function, how IT is perceived within, how the CISO's group is perceived within IT, and how the rest of the organization perceives the CISO and his group. And so that has sort of provided me with this nomenclature that I'm going to introduce here, and at least an observation. And that is, I have observed what I refer to as the scapegoats. It's one mode of operation of CISOs, and the other mode of operation I term performance. So let me illustrate. The scapegoats, but before going to that illustration, let me use one last analogy just to sort of take this home. So I liken sort of my experience as being involved, having the opportunity to participate, listen in on the pre-game, motivation speeches of a lot of coaches, right? So if anyone's a professional sports enthusiast, before you go into the arena, the coach gives the team a rah-rah, a battle cry. So I've gotten the opportunity to listen to many of these, and so this is what I'm drawing from, and this is from where I've made the observation about the scapegoats and the performance. So I have been known to shadow, aka stalk, a bunch of these performers on LinkedIn, on Twitter. I get every so often messages from people saying, "Hey, I just saw that you checked my profile," and so I have a very intense fascination in deconstructing what it takes to be sort of effective in your role and why. So back to illustrating, the scapegoats essentially their mode of operation is born out of that deeply held sense that it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when a breach is going to happen, right? So we have this meme that's very common in our community, right? And that's the mode of operation of the scapegoat mentality. It's they behave, and their outlook is reconciling against that moment of breach. How am I going to look? How is my team going to look? The performers, on the other hand, they lean forward. So they acknowledge that moment, but it's almost incidental. They see themselves as, being present to provide protective assurance for the organization to do what it needs to do. So if the organization wants to go left, they say, okay, in order to go left, this is what you need. You need A, B, and C. And these aren't fixed labels, they're more sort of preferences, kind of like personality types. I've seen the same CISO operate from both modes at different points in time. So what's the inspiration? Why is this important, right? The last week we talked about the importance of the why. So this is my why. So the inspiration for this talk, for me, was my mother. So my mother is a pediatrician. She works in public health. And in early 2004, she and her team from the Ministry of Public Health, they came up with a very startling statistic. So 45% of children in Balmayo, which is a city about, a village, quite frankly, about 50 kilometers from the capital city of Cameroon, 45% of the children under 5 were dying. Now think about that for a second. So as a result of this, the local chief, thought it was witchcraft. So he put out an APB, if you will, for witch doctors, within neighboring villages and the circumference of, witch doctors coming to reinforce kept increasing. And my mom and her team, they went in there, to sort of try and figure it out. Now at first, the chief was hesitant to give them permission because he was like, whoa, I'm not going to be responsible, if, the evil forces come after you. He didn't want to be responsible for that. So after it took a lot of negotiation, but finally, the chief gave them permission, to try and figure it out, to use their white magic, as he called it, reference to medicine. So they went in there and immediately they set out to find out the children that weren't dying, the positive deviants. What were they doing differently, right? And so they found, the children within that population group, and they monitored them very closely. They tried to figure out, what they ate, what kind of families they came from, and all that kind of stuff. And what they found out were two things that jumped out at them relatively quickly. And this is a condensed version of some quite a bit of time. But what jumped out at them were two things. A, those children, on average, had a smaller number of siblings, right? So they were smaller families. And B, those children had a more balanced diet. They ate more, varied types of foods. Now, what's important to note here is that in this community, they're a subsistence community. So they do a lot of farming, and they grow mainly a root called cassava. It's very versatile in a number of ways you can eat it. So you can make quite a bit of things from cassava. And so armed with this this hunch, with this information, what they did was they identified a group of mothers, whom they termed Maman Lumière, which in French can be translated as mother of light. But these were like beacons within the community. So elderly, some of the more elderly and more respected women. And they taught them on what constitutes a balanced diet. So they said, bring in a little fish, bring in a little meat. And these are all things that were local, to them, not, things that they needed to go through great expense to get. And so they trained these women, and these women in turn organized daily feedings. So the women would sort of rally around other groups of women, and they would assign responsibility. Okay, you bring fish, you bring meat. So it wasn't too burdensome on any one individual. And then they had, they had daily feedings, and they weighed, the group of children beforehand. And after 10 weeks, the results were dramatic. I wish I had a chart to show you, but they kept data about. And so what happened was two things. A, these children, because they had focused feeding, someone feeding them as opposed to them fighting with their siblings around the same plate, they had more nourishment. And B, they had more diversity of nourishment. And so at the time after 10 weeks, at the time of my mother and her team leaving, they quickly identified, that the problem solved, right? Malnutrition. And so it's funny, there's actually video footage of the chief, rallying the village and the entire village, thanking and honoring my mother and her team, and basically, proclaiming that the white man's magic is better than their version of magic. So what's the underlying theme here? The underlying theme here is positive deviants. Who are the rock stars within our community, and what are they doing, right? And what I'm about to present is sort of my humble perspective on that matter. And if any of this sounds familiar, it's because it is, right? People are actively doing that. So has anyone ever heard of the IT Process Institute? Yes, no? So I encourage you to check it out. It is an organization entirely devoted to understanding what those beacons of excellence are within our community, within different IT organizations, and they do a lot of publications centered around what their observations are. So why is all of this important? Well, it's pretty important for the same reasons that leadership is important, right? So I have to be careful. I have to do attribution on this slide. This is from an outfit named CSC Consulting, and they came up with what I think is a really brilliant illustration of what leadership provides and the different types of outcome. So what you're looking at is a matrix, if you will, and it always starts with vision on the left, and then the things that can flow as an offshoot of that vision. So you have the skills, incentive structure, the resources, and an action plan. Now, when all of these things come into perfect alignment, you get change. You actually get positive change. Now, going down sort of through the middle there, diagonally, if there's no skill, if there's vision with no skill, then you get a situation where it can be confusing or just a lot of anxiety. When you get vision without any incentives, you get into sort of disbelief. People don't buy it. When you get vision and skills and incentives with no resources, there's stagnation. Now, is any of this resonating with anyone in your organizations? And the ways in which we waffle. So this is why this is important. This is why leadership matters, and this is why sort of I think it is imperative that as a community rather, we sort of discern between, we sort of come up with some way to sort of work the soft skills. What soft skills are important that people need to have and bring to bear? I mean, all of this assumes a certain underlying baseline of competence when it comes to skill set, right? These are about those more nuanced skills that we need to have in order to affect change within our organization. So the next chart that you see is our people, process, and technology. Right? Again, when these come into alignment and perfect agree, there's success, right? And who influences this? Who influences this at the organization more than anyone? It's the CISO, right? The CISO is ultimately responsible for the alignment of people, process, and technology. And so you look at the different permutations. Where you have good technology and good process, without the right people, you see poor adoption. How many people can relate to that, right? When you have good people, good technology, and no process, right? Inconsistent operation. And my favorite is actually the bottom, the last one, where you don't have any of the above, and literally have no defenses. But is this resonating? Can anyone understand? Is there a doubt in anyone's mind as to why this is important for us to come up with a nomenclature, if you will, for the skill sets that are required and the mindsets that are required to be effective as a CISO? Any questions so far? Fantastic. So we'll assume that we're all on board, and so we're going to move forward. So in terms of CISO responsibilities, what we've seen historically is sort of a shift from an evolution, if you will, from that technical CISO, the CISO who's sort of, who worries about systems and configuration settings more so than anything else, to now sort of a more strategic role where the CISO gets invited, with other executives to sort of contribute to a strategic direction of the company, right? So the Holy Grail, according to a CISO friend of mine, the Holy Grail, according to him, is he'll know he'll have arrived the day when his threat intelligence information is on the same vein as the marketing intelligence information. So in other words, he wants to get to that point where, when the organization is considering what lines of business to get into, and they're doing their strategic SWOT analysis, your strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. He wants them to look at the information that he provides on par with marketing intelligence. And I think that's a very worthy aspiration, and I submit that to the rest of the community for discussion about that and for aspiration maybe. So from a CISO's desk, who are the people that matter, right? Or who are the people that sort of consume the CISO's attention? This is a simple mind map that illustrates my observation of who those clusters of people are. You know, you have the attackers, you have the CISO's boss, you have your staff, and then you have the business units, the people over on the other side, as they call them, and then the customers, these people who consume the stuff, you know, the product or the services that the organization is producing. And then, you know, quite frankly, you know, the assessors, you know, internal and external. And in my observation, and I'm looking at the room keeping to those individuals who raised their hand earlier as current and former CISOs. In my observation, the more the CISOs that operate from the operation of scapegoat, they tended to spend a disproportionate amount of their time focused on attackers and assessors. And then those that were more strategic in spending their time, those performers, as I call them, tended to spend a lot more of their time on business units and customers. Does that resonate? Absolutely.
Can you give a little more detail about what you're calling assessors?
Right. Good question. So these are internal auditors. These are QSAs, people who basically come into the CISO's environment and tell them how good they're doing. Does that make sense?
The AIG.
I'm sorry?
The AIG.
There you go, the AIGs of the world. So with that, with this panoramic view out of the way, I'd like to go into what I observe to be the 7 attributes of performance, or the 7 attributes that sort of push people, individuals, more towards the performer part of the continuum than the scapegoat. And the first one is serious play. So this is sort of, this is from Carl Jung, you know, the famous psychologist whose contribution to society was the notion that we all have archetypes, right? We all have different parts of ourself. And what's really important to note here is that the CISOs that are performance, you know, that are the performers, they sort of integrate their inner child with their adult. So they sort of have a healthy dispassion. They sort of are dispassionate in a healthy way from their position. They have a sort of healthy distance away from the gravity of what your responsibility is. So I'll give you an illustration. So one of the CISOs that I sort of motivated this talk, he said to me once, he goes, Franklin, you know, I see myself as the bodyguard of VIP. It's my responsibility to make sure that, you know, he stays alive, he or she stays alive. And inevitably, I know that there's going to come a point where shots will be fired. And quite frankly, I could die. Or if I don't die, you know, my VIP will die. And I have to, and let's pause for a second and think about that statement, right? I mean, that invites the full gravity of sort of having to save this person's life or die in the process. I mean, that's pretty weighty. Now, a performer, on the other hand, you know, same circumstance, and his mindset, his or her mindset is more of, look, my job is to protect this individual. I have no control whatsoever about when shots will be fired. So I'm not going to dwell on that. What I will do is essentially, you know, prepare myself the best way I can and have my guard, my VIP wear protective vest, and then that enables them to do what they need to do, and so I don't have to be on edge all the time. So it's sort of a healthy sort of distance away from, you know, the gravity of what your role implies. So what's important to note here before I move on is notice the lack of ego, right? That's the P differentiator, is ego. So take out the ego and you get the performer. Now, how many people can relate, right, to the sort of prevalence of very ego-driven conversations within our community, right? And that's a rhetorical question, unless someone has a joke or a comment to that. All right, so the next skill that differentiates performers from scapegoats is that of focus. So performers are able to take on one thing at a time. And And focus here, is particularly important because we live in, the era of big data, right? We have Twitter. I'm sure some people are live tweeting this. We have so many things that, deluge, our attention. That grapple for our attention. And so it's almost like the ability to filter the noise from the signal is way more important than any other skill that we could have at this point in time. And the example I have here is I was sitting with a CISO delivering sort of, an end of assessment or an end of engagement report. And while sitting in his office, we kept getting interrupted, every 5 or so minutes with some new emergency. And each of them sounded pretty important to me. If I were him, I would have definitely said, okay, Franklin, hold on, I have to go address this. But he just sort of had this, attitude if it was going to be okay. And so at the end of the briefing, I said, help me understand, like, don't you think those things are pretty important? And he pulled out a do not do list. So how many people maintain a do not do list? I see it in each other. I mean, this is how sort of militant he was about protecting his time and his focus. And the point of it was he pre-committed about not doing certain things during certain periods of time. In other words, he ran his organization, and these are his words, in periods of sprints and then jogs. So the sprints are, the get things done, the sort of either augmenting the maturity level of a process or being strategically focused in introducing a whole new direction and a whole new series of initiatives that need, sort of to be put into processes and people and technology. So those were the sprint periods. The jogs were sort of, the more keep the lights on kind of thing. And during periods of sprint, he had literally a laser-like focus. I mean, nothing was going to sort of detract his attention. Now, two things came to mind as I sort of observed that situation. One was the fact that his teams became a lot more resourceful because they knew they couldn't count on him, which was, I think was absolutely amazing. Is, okay, we can't count on the CISO to divert their attention, so we're gonna have to look for a way to figure it out. And then the second thing that came to mind, quite frankly, came to mind much later in conversation with Wendy, my mentor, was a line from The Avengers. And Samuel L. Jackson has a very famous line in there where he goes, until such a time, that the world is coming to an end, we shall move as if it intends to continue spinning. Right? I'm sure I'm paraphrasing. But the point here is, let's go back to the story of the kids from Bamayo, right? People aren't dying. People aren't dying. It's let's maintain perspective and let's keep focus on what's really important so we can accomplish the mission of the organization.
Can you give maybe some examples of that to-do list?
Of the to-do list?
You focused on, the grand mission of the to-do list, staying focused, I should say, but what else did you see on it?
Excellent. So the question was, for those in the back of the room, the question was, what are some of the things that were on the not to-do list of that CISO that I mentioned? So patching, right? And this is, I'm glad you asked that question, because I sort of have this repertoire, this list of questions that I ask a lot of CISOs that I get an opportunity to interact with. And one of the questions on there is, what takes up your time that you wish did not, right? Like, what are some of the time drains for you? And patching is huge on this CISO's list. And funny enough, internal audit, interactions with internal audit was on there. He had basically a blocked amount of time he wasn't going to interact with internal audit.
Thank you.
So do you mean that these are things that you would not do during sprints?
Correct. These are things that you would not do during these sprints. Absolutely. Thank you for the question. So the next trait is that of rattling cages, right? And essentially, this is about ginning up, spirited debate. This is about, introducing just the right amount of controversy so that people don't go through the motions. So in our community, we have a lot of, standard conversations. It's very interesting when you read articles from 5-10 years ago, and you see that they're equally applicable. Some of it because it issues are still salient. But a lot of it, quite frankly, because I attribute it to intellectual laziness. We just don't push ourselves into sort of grounding it more, making things more relevant to the current time. And so this CISO that I inspired this bullet point or this trait, I have never met anyone the ability to sort of bring emotion out of anyone than this guy. So he has what I call cage rattling questions that he uses as devices to make people think. And I'll give you an example. So one of them was he asked his team, he said, if the company hired a screenwriter from Hollywood and they were about to do a movie about our team, what role shall we be assigned? Right? I mean, and that's sort of like from left field. It inspires a whole new way of thinking about the department and the role that you want to be. Another question he asked was, if your mother were to design, this system or some particular process, what would she do? And the point here, because the emotion can kind of get out of hand, but the point here is emotional content, not anger, right? So you don't want to get people angry and detract from the position of what you're taking, the intent. What you want to do is gin up just the right amount of sort of emotional fervor that people can stay away from sort of like the patterns of thinking and the patterns of conversation, and actually have meaningful dialogue, especially when it comes to interacting with business units, because they try to have as little to do with you as possible as the CISO. They sort of perceive the IT security group as, we have to deal with you. Just tell us what to do and we'll do it, kind of thing. And so bringing it home to them, making it relevant and making it resonant, an effective device is the cage rattle. And just to pause here for a second and sort of bring us all back in the thread we're going in. So these are all mindsets, right? These are sort of devices that are applicable with different tactics and with different variables within your specific environments. So there are tactics that go along with this, but as you listen to this, I want you to sort of switch the variables to your environment and figure out what set of tactics work. But it's more important to retain the sort of the mindset behind the traits. Does that make sense? All right. The next trait is empathy. This is, quite frankly, one of the most prevalent and quite, in a lot of ways, the most important one, next to the one about synthesize, having a healthy dispassion in your job title. And this is important for a couple of reasons. The biggest one being, as you ascend up the corporate ladder, if you're not careful, you sort of become, have an unrealistic impression of what really happens where the rubber meets the road. People tell you what they think you want to hear, and if you don't deliberately, try and sort of follow the division of knowing what's happening at the point, at the point where the rubber meets the road, you can lose a lot of empathy. And so, a lot of times, the CISO's job is about managing expectations with that, panoramic view of stakeholders, right? And you can't manage expectations effectively if you don't sort of keep a pulse on what's going on within these different communities, right? So for any of the CISOs that raised their hand initially, I imagine you came up from, so sir, what track, so did you came up through network engineering rank, network engineering? So as a CISO, do you think it's important, or to what extent do you think it's important to sort of go back to meet the network engineering teams and get a real sense of what's happening in the network?
By all means.
You're welcome to contribute. So he's shaking his, nodding and saying, by all means, anyone else care to contribute? Like, what kind of stories they have about making sure that they stay grounded? You guys should have held off on the t-shirts. Yes, sir, please, thank you.
At my company, instead of traditional knock, we have sort of a group of people, 3 different shifts, 24 hours. They're sort of on call permanently, but they're all in one room. So they're all working on problems all the time. So I spend time in there sometimes to sort of get a sense of what they're dealing with and how they're dealing with it. So, and I find it very helpful because it kind of it often shows that what I thought was going on is totally wrong.
Right, right. And this is, I really appreciate that because this is precisely what I was hoping to get out, in this point. Is because, especially as an assessor, right? I go into an organization as an outsider, and I go talk to the people at the point of acceptance of credit card data. And the things that they tell me are going on are quite frankly, completely different from what the CISO or the director of the InfoSec told me was going on. I mean, it's almost like, are you even in the same company? But a lot of times, we've come to expect that, and it's I don't mean that in a condescending way. It's just people have different sensibilities, and so it drives home the importance of seeking grounding influences, because as a CISO, you really have to make sure you can manage expectations accordingly. The next trait is one of keeping measurements, so keeping score, right? So there's a lot of documentation out there, list publications, which I'm not going to bore you by regurgitating, about how the metrics program should work. There's a very famous book. How many people have heard of or have read Andrew Jacquet's book? Yeah. So there's lots of really good guidance out there about metrics. So how I want to sort of incrementally, submit something to you for consideration is this one story about a CISO who does her best to mimic Wall Street. So the way Wall Street reports are done, she does her best to report her security program that way. So in addition to sort of doling out information about how they did this quarter, she basically relays that back to how they did in a similar period last year. And this, she got so much resonance, so much traction from her executive leadership in that way, because she's sort of speaking their language, right? This is how they communicate. They say how they, and she gives factors that attribute to what disparity exists between the now and the same period last year. So what I'd just like to submit here is that it's not so much important what the measures are as what the trend lines indicate and what the story is for those trend lines. So the next one that I've seen that really separates the performers from the scapegoats is it's about the Medici effect, right? How many people have heard of the Medici effect or have read the book The Medici Effect? So this is about basically combining different disciplines to come up with a whole that is greater than the sum of its parts, right? So you see a nerdy gentleman hugging a drag queen. Yeah, it's awkward. It's very awkward to get the InfoSec team to go spend time with the marketing people.
Which is which.
Right. And there's a meme, and that's a hashtag because there's actually a meme within our community for awkward hugs, right? So the point is, let's embrace that as a community. Let's embrace sort of that diversity of discipline. So, and the goal here is to burst out of our patterns. So I have here a creative backpack, and this is something that, quite frankly, I learned from this specific CISO. So, and I encourage anyone to reach out and get some. And essentially, it allows for creative thinking. And creativity and innovation, to use that term, is born out of creating new associations. And that's exactly what these cards do. So for anything you're thinking about, and this is quite literally what she does, she whips out a bunch of these at random and then reads them and then tries to apply them to their situation. So I just did the same thing. And the first one says, do the unexpected, right? So that provokes a moment of thought. What would be unexpected about this new strategy or this new product or this new process that we're trying to, what would be unexpected? And what's actionable, quite frankly, about the unexpected is if people are surprised, in a positive way, of course, then they're more engaged. So that could inform sort of, that notion. There's one about ask what if. There's one about simplify. How could we simplify this further? And essentially what I'm hoping to accomplish by talking about this trait is highlighting how if you tackle things, we all have thinking patterns, we all have action patterns. And if you expand that a little further, our organizations have thinking patterns and our organizations have patterns of action. They're not evident a lot of times, but they exist. And so how can you create just the right amount of entropy, just the right amount of dissonance so that cerebral combustions can happen? And so one of the things that I really invite this community to do, and I will be doing the same kind of homework, is for us to spend some time and think about people from different disciplines that we can invite. So, for example, next year at BSides, what if we had a track, right, that was devoted to, epidemiologists, or just a wide open track, where we invited an epidemiologist, a clown, and say, a pilot, right? What could we learn from those disciplines? And I encourage everyone to sort of spend some time and think about that for a moment. And in fact, I'd say, I dare say, it'd be a dream of mine for us to just have these different disciplines that we can interact with and sort of see what emerges. And my submission is only good things will happen. And then the next trait is that of sharing, right? So all these different works are not important unless they're communicated. And communication and sharing is one of the most ignored pieces of advice. But it's nonetheless incredibly important. And the goal here is to, on that matrix of stakeholders, minus your attackers sometimes, you want to share what's happening. You want to, provide situational awareness. You want to bring it home to them. You want to sort of have these moments where people at any given point in time understand what the organization is doing and how your role and theirs sort of intersect. So I have a CISO who inspires this, and he's actually out of here in Las Vegas. And literally, this gentleman who briefed the janitor if the janitor walked in, or if he ran by the janitor. And he would talk about things like SCADA, talk about the industrial controls, and how relevant it is how important it is for the janitor to safeguard the room where the controllers are, because that they can turn off the lights, or they could. I mean, he literally has a message, for anyone and everyone. And the effect of that, from my observation, was that people would hear a story on the news and they would immediately reach out to him and go like, oh yeah, I saw a story and it was about this, company or this situation where they got breached, and it sort of brought it back home. And he is, in many ways, like a moving billboard for the importance of protecting the company's assets. So this is about sharing, right? And we all know that sharing is caring, right? So with that, I really want to thank you all for listening and watching intently, and everyone's attention is still up here, because that's what has led up to this moment, right? So what I'm trying to do is share what I've learned, and I really look to you, for feedback on this current and former CISOs. Does that resonate? For the aspiring CISOs, is this something? Are these things that we should devote time, to work on and towards? And that's the story as far as sharing is concerned. So with that, I will open up to questions and comments. Yes, sir.
The one habit that you didn't get into that I found to be a key is listen, active listening. All too often we come into a situation where we have the answers. We know how to secure this, we know how to secure that, we know what the risks are, blah, blah, blah. And of course we come in with a pre-canned solution. We don't see how it's completely inappropriate in a situation because we haven't taken the time to listen, to understand, to put ourselves in the shoes of the other individual.
Absolutely. So, point well accepted, right? So, how I would sort of incorporate this into the talk, but your point is well received. And I think so did everyone hear the gentleman's comment? about the importance of listening as a, so how I would sort of incorporate that, or implicit in the point about empathy, you know, is listening. But you're absolutely right, it deserves emphasis all on its own, because that is, you know, there's a dearth of listening. So I really appreciate that comment. Any others? Yes, sir.
Franklin, you talked about empathizing, and I agree completely. But I find one area, having come into the CISO role from a technical background, I find it very hard to empathize with folks in the roles that I previously held. I have a great example. We're making a firewall perimeter change in one of the institutions, and the current firewall engineer was telling me how long this was going to take, and it was going to take weeks of prep time, and it was bullshit. And you're in that situation, and this is a 20-minute job, and you want to push them out of the chair and just say, move and let me do it. Right? Any advice?
So, I don't know that it qualifies as advice, but I do have commentary, right? So, and I'll just give it to you straight. So the comment was, did everyone hear the comment? Okay. So what I do have to say about that is the following. So I've read, there's, I forget the elegant way to phrase it, but here's the concept. The concept is we often evaluate people in roles that we formerly held by the time when we were at our best in that role. And we're sort of looking at them now and we're thinking, why does it take you 5 minutes? Why does it take you 2 days to do what I could do in 20 minutes? What is, you know, is we often forget a lot of times is that before it took us to the point where we took 5 minutes to do that job, we had the sucky period, right? And so what, and nonetheless, I mean, that doesn't, there is such a thing as competence, you know, that people need to have. And there's such a thing as, you know, business needs to get done. All I'm introducing is just that for consideration, right? To what extent is there a sort of a growth period that as a CISO you can nurture in your team, right? So I imagine I'm going to get feedback from my world-class mentor over here about, you know, my suckiness during this, the suckiness factor during this talk, right? And so if she were to evaluate me based on where she is now, I mean, that would be unfair. But if she, you know, she puts that in, and that's what I have to contribute.
That's great.
As far as that is
That's an insight I hadn't thought of.
Yep. Any other comments or questions?
Is there a name for that phenomenon?
I forget, there's a very elegant name. It's like
The sucky period.
I like that. Sucky period. All right.
right, I just blank on it. But the gentleman's name is Ramit Sethi. So Ramitsethi. And he writes a blog, and one of the seminal books that he wrote is, I can't remember the name now. But if you look up his name, the book is about how as IT professionals we should prevent ourselves from becoming sort of, so in the book he talks about the 3 days: automation, Asia for outsourcing, and what was the last day? So Asia, automation, and consumer, something about basically our skills becoming more and more widely available. Like,
Commoditization.
I'm sorry?
Commoditization.
Commoditization, there you go, that's the term. The commoditization of our skills. As things get automated, as things get outsourced, and as you know, more and more of our skill sets become commoditized, what can we add? And I would submit, you know, that's something we ought to be thinking about. But that's the name, that's the gentleman who came up with this concept about evaluating people and giving them some latitude. That's such a big deal. Any other questions? Really nice comments. I really appreciate that. Any other comments? Jokes? I'm sorry?
The cards you have, what are they?
They're called Creative Whack Pack.
Okay, thank you.
So, and another thing that I learned from this lady that I use is a book called Lateral Thinking. That may not be the name of the book, but the author's name is Edward de Bono. So D-E and then space B-O-N-O. So Edward de Bono. He waxes poetic about, you know, wearing different hats. It's called 6 Hats Thinking, I think. And it's about a concept called lateral thinking. You know, basically introducing entropy into your thought patterns. And he literally talks about, wearing, a green hat, meaning looking at the same sort of circumstances, from a creative perspective. How can I, make something out of nothing? And then looking at it from the perspective that we in IT get to wear a lot of, which is what is wrong with this, and beating up into that in terms of what's wrong. And then looking at it in terms of what's right. And invariably, by doing that, you sort of come up with this incredibly comprehensive, outlook on. And a lot of it also has to do with developing the capabilities. So, as I mentioned, and it's very important to me if I'm successful up here that you retain, these are mindsets, right? So the capabilities that go along with these mindsets don't have to all come from your team, right? You can develop them. You can develop them by, interacting with the marketing folks, for example, or with the accounting folks, because they specialize in a certain type of thinking, which according to Edward Bono, I think it's the way he thinks. I forget. But it's the more facts and figures. They want to see concrete, empirical stuff. And then the marketers, they're more green hats. They want to, they see landfills, and they want to, be more creative. So, and to sort of come back to your question, something where someone is sort of, bullshitting you. The notion of how can you look at it differently from the perspective of, what, if you were to walk a mile in that person's shoes, would you necessarily see it that way? So, any other questions or comments? Really good. Yes, sir.
It's often said that not CISOs make a position for very long periods of time because companies don't realise the person is about the CISO. So the advice or guidance for the company to know what about the CISO is supposed to be.
So, there were points there where I didn't hear you, so I just want to repeat it to make sure. The question is there any notion, do I have any comments about how a company can discern if they have a bad or a good CISO? That's a good way? Okay. So, yes, I do. I have ideas. So, I talked about my repertoire of questions that I have for CISOs that I'm fortunate to interact with. One of the questions that I always ask them is, what would you base your bonus on? Right? And I've gotten a very wide range of answers. One day I hope to, work with someone to sort of publish these, because it's very interesting to me, how CISOs perceive themselves, compared to how the rest of the organization perceives the CISOs. So to sort of come back to your question, how does an organization know if they have a good or a bad CISO? So my submission, or at least my contribution to that question, would be, research, right? So research organizations exist, like the 451, like Gartner, like Forrester. They have incredibly comprehensive documentation about, what types of CISOs make sense for what types of organizations, what types of organizations where it makes sense for the CISO to report to, and so essentially, I would answer your question as follows: research, and then B, and this is sort of drives to the heart of what I hope emerges as a maturation of this process. To what extent does your CISO embody the performer traits? And I imagine there's going to be some maturation that this will have to go through to incorporate increased emphasis for listening. But to what extent does your CISO, assuming a certain level of competency, right, embody these traits? And I hope that's helpful. Yes, sir.
I don't know if you still have time, but you interested me when you said, you asked them, what do you want your bonus to be based on? I'm big into incentives, driving behavior, but at the same time, as a CISO, you're not producing revenue. You're the bodyguard. As a bodyguard, you just go by how many of your customers get shot, or how would you bonus that?
So the question is, he wants to know what these CISOs have responded to the question about, how would you, what would you base your bonus on? Do you want to answer that, or do you want to?
Actually, yes, and you are producing revenue. You're just not aware of it because you're not tracking it. Take a look at how many of your customers have evaluated your security posture as an aspect of being willing to do business with you. That is how you can track the added value that you're bringing to your business. Look at that as a percentage over time. Look at that as an absolute over time. Start tracking it. If that value is decreasing, you are not adding enough value to your business. If that value is increasing, you are adding increasing value to the business as security becomes important to your customers. You get security surveys from your customers, track who those customers are, track successful engagements with them, track engagements that fall apart, track customers that you lose. Understand why you lost them. Was security a part of why you lost them? Simple, basic business metrics that you should be collecting that are the most important metrics you can possibly collect because they inform on exactly that issue. How effective are you being at meeting your customers' needs and bringing value into the business?
Thank you, well said. So one last comment. There's an emerging subculture within our community, right, that I don't call them, they call themselves the quants. Anyone ever paid attention to, and they believe everything is a data problem. Everything just means you don't, if you don't know the answer to a problem, it just means you don't have the data and you need to find it. So with that, I thank you again for your time and your attention. I'm very grateful.